Hello, my name is Ben Vanpeperstraete. We are here now at the CSD, the Commission on Sustainable Development to the UN, who oversees everything that is sustainable development on a global scale. We are about to finish with the session. We had 2 weeks of intense negotiations. A bunch of negotiators and me went to sleep yesterday this morning at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock this morning. And after 2 hours of sleep, we are gathering here again for, let's say, what is the final plenary. So we have some things on the agenda that we want to decide on, and hopefully that will materialize in a few hours. But after the weekend, the big work starts, because then a lot of people around the world start planning for Rio+20. So what is Rio+20? It's the follow-up of what happened in '92 in Rio, 40 years after what happened in Stockholm, and even longer after environment was actually identified as a problem. However, Rio+20 is not about the environment, it's about sustainable development, which is basically about combining ecological, social and economical issues into a holistic view and provide holistic solutions to those problems. So Rio gave the planet quite a lot. It gave us Agenda 21, which was a blueprint for the 21st century, how to live in harmony with ourselves as a society, our need for economic growth for some reason, and also the carrying capacity and the boundaries of a planet, only having one planet at our disposal. And most of it is still actual. Rio also gave us a Rio Declaration, which has principles, a whole set of them. Some are more famous than others, like polluter pays principle, precautionary principle, integrating all the external costs, intergenerational equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, the right for information and participation. And I could go on quite some time like that. It also gave us Forest Declaration, and it also gave us 3 conventions. They're not all attached on the physical time of Rio, but they're in name and fame connected with Rio. Those are the one on climate change, the one on biodiversity, and the one on drought and desertification. So that's what Rio gave us. 10 years later, people also gathered around in Johannesburg to see a little bit the follow-up, and they came up with what is called the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. Now, next year in Rio, about this time, people will again meet up and they will come up with a focused document on what to do next, how to see sustainable development at the international level for the next 20 years. And on one hand, it's an easy thing, because most of the vision and the principles of Rio are still valid, but on the other hand, the issues are more pressing than ever, and the solution is more complicated as ever. We saw what happened in climate change in Copenhagen, in Cancun. People are still worried for Durban. And even on biodiversity, we're not really putting a stop to the massive slashing of diversity of our biological species. So obviously, in terms of solution, time is more pressing than ever. And that's what we're trying to do next year. So what is this conference going to talk about? It basically has 2 themes and 2 objectives, just to make things more complicated than they ought to be. The 2 themes are green economy in the framework of sustainable development and poverty eradication. Obviously that's quite a mouthful, and it tells a lot about the level of trust or distrust on the concept of green economy, and in what extent it can be a toolbox to achieve poverty eradication and sustainable development. The second one is the institutional framework for sustainable development. It's basically questioning how can we strengthen and improve governance so that we really deliver upon sustainable development. A lot of talking has been done there on global level, but it even at the same time actually talks about how can we strengthen government at the local level. How can communities be more resilient or are better empowered to deal with the challenges and the consequences of our time. On the other hand, you have the objectives. And that's the part where it gets a little bit complicated. What is the difference between objectives and themes? But keeping that aside, the objectives are how to secure political support for sustainable development, because obviously it's not on the top of mind of our leaders of today. It's most of the times in obscure environmental ministries rather than at economic ministries or prime minister's offices. It's about the progress up to date and the implementation gaps. So that's really referring to Rio. How are we doing for the precautionary principle? How are we doing in terms of climate change? How are we doing into protecting our social system? All those questions. And last but not least, what are the new and emerging challenges? On those issues we think about things that were not identified at Rio but really need some addressing. I'm thinking about issues such as water, oceans, urbanization, that still needs a better home. So that's in a nutshell Rio, and obviously what's behind it is more complicated as the UN prefers it. So the question is, what do young people do in there? And that is probably also an equally complicated question, because young people make up half of the world's population. So there will be a lot of independent, incredible initiatives happening everywhere around the world. But we as a major group of youth and children try to give a frame of better connecting and upscaling the efforts that individual youth groups are making. My organization, Rio+20s, which is really a youth-led organization only dedicated to Rio+20, wants to provide a sort of home for those Rio+20 somethings, because basically the summit is about us. It tries to provide a little bit of a shell to channel some of the resources and efforts to basically facilitate all those efforts. So our question or offer in the form of a question to a lot of people is basically, you have something, you want to do something, you want to connect. How can we be of assistance? And I would just all invite you just to get into contact with us. So to do this shameless plug at the end, www.rio+20s.org. And I hope we can get in touch, because this is really about our generation taking up the fight, taking up the lead, and showing that we have to change stuff in the very near future, because otherwise our generation will be the one who is actually suffering all the consequences. I'm thinking in terms of environmental degradation, I'm thinking in terms of financial debt, but I'm also thinking in terms of paying the pension system and in what kind of economy we're still inheriting. And in order to avoid this, the only solution is that we just start getting our act together and start advocating for a decent prospect for the future. So come and join us.